Mary Thompson sat in her old Honda Civic outside Pine Ridge gun range for 10 minutes before she could make herself get out. Her hands were shaking, but not from the cold October air. She had never held a real gun before, and the idea scared her more than she wanted to admit. The parking lot was full of big trucks and SUVs. Most had hunting stickers on their back windows. Mary looked down at her simple jeans and plain white sneakers. She felt like she didn't belong here, but she needed to do this. After 20 years of marriage, her husband had left her for a younger woman. He had always told her she was weak and couldn't do anything right. Mary wanted to prove him wrong, even if he would never see it. She grabbed her small purse and walked toward the building. The sign above the door read, Pine Ridge Gun Range and Training Center. Through the windows she could see men in camouflage clothes talking and laughing. Her stomach felt sick, but she pushed the door open anyway. The smell hit her first. Gun, oil, and something metallic. The sound was loud too. Even though the shooting range was in the back, she could hear the sharp cracks of gunfire through the thick walls. A bell rang when she walked in, and several men turned to look at her. Their eyes moved from her face to her clothes and back again. None of them smiled. "Can I help you?" asked the woman behind the counter. She had short gray hair and looked friendly enough. "I'm here for the beginner's shooting class," Mary said quietly. "I called last week." "Oh, you must be Mary Thompson. I'm Betty. We talked on the phone." The woman smiled and handed her a clipboard with papers. "Fill these out and Jake will be with you in a minute." Mary found a chair in the corner and started filling out the forms. She could hear the men talking, but she tried not to listen. One of them had a loud voice that carried across the room. "I got 3 deer last weekend," the loud man was saying. 2 bucks and a doe. Clean shots, all of them. 1 shot, 1 kill, that's what I always say. Another man laughed. "That's nothing, Tony. Remember when I got that 12-point buck 2 years ago? 300 yards with my 30-06? Now that was a shot." Mary kept her head down and continued writing. The forms asked about her experience with guns, which was easy to answer. None. They asked why she wanted to learn, and she wrote personal protection in small letters. "All right, everyone, let's get started." A man's voice cut through the chatter. Mary looked up to see a tall Hispanic man in his 40s walking into the waiting area. He had short black hair with some gray at the sides and wore a black polo shirt with Pine Ridge on the chest. His arms were covered with tattoos, and he walked like a soldier. "I'm Jake Martinez, and I'll be your instructor for the next 10 weeks, he said in a clear, strong voice. "Before we go any further, I want to make something clear. Guns are not toys. They are tools that can save your life or take someone else's life. Every single one of you needs to take this seriously, or you can leave right now." He looked around the room at each person. When his eyes met Mary's, she saw something different than she had seen in the other men's faces. He didn't look at her like she didn't belong. He just looked at her like she was another student. "Let's go around the room and introduce ourselves," Jake continued. "Tell us your name and why you're here." A big man with a red baseball cap went first. "I'm Tony Rodriguez. I work construction, been hunting since I was 12. Just want to get better with handguns for hunting backup." He had the loud voice Mary had heard earlier. When he talked, he looked mostly at the other men, barely glancing at Mary. Next was a thin man in a police uniform. "Steve Collins, 15 years with the county sheriff's department. Taking this class to improve my skills and maybe learn something new." He spoke with confidence and sat up straight in his chair. A young woman with blonde hair went next. "I'm Lisa Brown. I'm in college, and my dad thought I should learn to protect myself." She seemed nervous but friendly. One by one, the 12 people in the class introduced themselves. There were 9 men and 3 women, but Mary was the only woman over 30. Most of the men talked about hunting or protection. The other women mentioned wanting to learn for safety. Finally, it was Mary's turn. All eyes were on her, and she felt her face getting hot. "I'm Mary Thompson," she said in a voice so quiet that Jake had to ask her to speak up. "I'm Mary Thompson," she repeated louder. "I'm recently divorced and want to learn to protect myself." She didn't mention that she had never even held a gun, or that her hands shook when she was nervous. or that her ex-husband used to tell her she couldn't learn anything new because she was too stupid. Tony leaned over to the man next to him and whispered something. Both men smiled. Mary saw it and felt her face burn with shame, but she didn't say anything. Jake either didn't notice or chose to ignore it. All right, before we handle any firearms, we're going to spend this first class learning about gun safety. These rules will keep you alive and keep others alive. I don't care if you've been hunting for 30 years or if you've never seen a gun before. Everyone follows the same rules in my class. He started writing on a whiteboard at the front of the room. Rule number 1, treat every gun like it's loaded even when you know it's not. Rule number 2, never point a gun at anything you don't want to destroy. Rule number 3, keep your finger off the trigger until you're ready to shoot. Rule number 4, know what's behind your target. For the next hour, Jake talked about different types of guns, how they worked, and what could go wrong if you didn't follow the safety rules. He showed them pictures of accidents and told stories about people who got hurt because they were careless. Mary took notes in a small notebook she had brought. She wrote down everything Jake said, even things that seemed obvious. Some of the men looked bored. Tony kept checking his phone, and Steve acted like he knew everything already. But Mary listened to every word. This was all new to her, and she wanted to learn it right. When the class ended, people started packing up their things. Tony walked past Mary's chair and looked down at her notebook, which was full of neat handwriting. Planning to write a book about it? He asked with a smirk. Mary closed the notebook quickly. I just want to remember everything, she said. Tony shook his head and walked away, saying something to his friend about soccer moms playing with guns. Mary heard him, and her face felt hot again, but she also felt something else, a small spark of anger that she hadn't felt in a long time. Jake was putting away his materials when Mary approached him. Excuse me, Mr. Martinez? Just call me Jake. What can I do for you? I've never held a gun before, she admitted. Will I be able to keep up with the class? Jake looked at her seriously. Mary, some of the best shooters I know started with no experience at all. The people who think they know everything are usually the ones who make mistakes. You take notes, you ask questions, and you listen. That tells me you'll do just fine. Mary nodded and thanked him. As she walked to her car, she could hear Tony and some of the other men laughing loudly in the parking lot. She didn't look their way, but she could feel them watching her. Driving home, Mary thought about what Jake had said. Maybe she could do this. Maybe her ex-husband was wrong about her. Maybe she wasn't too old or too stupid to learn something new. She had 9 more classes to find out. The second week of class was when Mary first held a real gun. Jake led the group into the shooting range, which was much louder than the classroom. Even with ear protection on, the sound of gunfire made Mary jump every time someone pulled a trigger. Today, we're going to start with .22 caliber pistols, Jake announced, holding up a small black gun. These have very little kick, so they're perfect for beginners. He showed them how to hold the gun properly, how to line up the sights, and how to squeeze the trigger slowly. Mary watched carefully and took more notes in her little notebook. She noticed that Tony rolled his eyes when he saw her writing. It's not rocket science, lady, Tony said loud enough for others to hear. Point and shoot, even a kid can do it. Steve nodded in agreement. I've been shooting since I was 8 years old. My dad taught me on his old .22 rifle. This stuff is pretty basic. When it was time to actually shoot, Jake divided the class into pairs. Mary found herself paired with Lisa, the college student who seemed just as nervous as she was. At least we can be scared together, Lisa whispered with a shaky smile. Mary picked up her assigned pistol with trembling hands. The gun felt heavier than she expected and cold against her palms. Jake stood behind her watching as she tried to remember all the things he had taught them. Feet shoulder-width apart, Jake said patiently. Lean slightly forward, both hands on the gun. Line up the front sight with the back sight, then put that on your target. Mary raised the gun toward the paper target 15 feet away. The sights seemed to jump around no matter how hard she tried to hold them steady. Her heart was beating so fast she could hear it in her ears. Take a deep breath. Let half of it out. Then squeeze the trigger slowly, Jake instructed. Mary did as he said. and pulled the trigger. The gun made a sharp crack and jumped in her hands. She looked downrange at her target and saw nothing. She had missed the entire paper. Behind her, she heard Tony snort with laughter. "Did you even hit the wall?" he asked his friend loud enough for everyone to hear. Mary's face turned red, but she tried again. This time her shot hit the very edge of the paper, nowhere near the black circle in the center. Her third shot missed completely again. Lisa wasn't doing much better. Her shots were scattered all over the target, but at least they were hitting the paper. After 10 shots each, both women looked at their targets with disappointment. Meanwhile, Tony and Steve were shooting tight groups near the center of their targets. They stood with their arms crossed, watching Mary and Lisa struggle. "Maybe you should try a bigger target," Steve suggested to Mary, but his tone wasn't helpful. It sounded like he was talking to a child. "Or maybe try standing closer," Tony added. "A lot closer." The other men in the class weren't much better with their comments. Some of them tried to be helpful, but their advice came out sounding like they thought Mary was hopeless. By the end of the second class, Mary had fired 30 rounds and only hit the paper with about half of them. None of her shots were anywhere near the center of the target. She felt embarrassed and frustrated as she helped clean up the brass casings from the floor. "Don't worry about it," Jake told her quietly as the others were leaving. "Nobody's good on their second day. This takes time and practice." But Mary could see the doubt in his eyes too. She thanked him and walked to her car, listening to Tony and his friends talking loudly in the parking lot. "I don't know why some people even bother," Tony was saying. "You either have it or you don't. That lady's never going to be able to hit anything. Give her a few more weeks and she'll quit," Steve replied. "They always do." Mary sat in her car for a long time before starting the engine. Part of her wanted to quit right then. Her ex-husband's voice seemed to echo in her head, telling her she was wasting her time, that she wasn't smart enough or strong enough to learn something like this. But another part of her, a small, angry part, refused to give up. She drove to the library where she worked and spent her lunch break looking up books about shooting. She found 3 books about marksmanship and checked them out. That evening, Mary read the first book cover to cover. It talked about breathing, sight alignment, trigger control, and mental focus. The author said that good shooting was more mental than physical. Mary wasn't sure if she believed that, but she kept reading. The third week was even worse. Mary's shots were still scattered all over the target, and now the class was shooting at 25 feet instead of 15. The target looked impossibly small, and Mary's hands shook even more than before. "Relax," Jake told her. "You're trying too hard. Let the gun do the work." But Mary couldn't relax. Every time she raised the gun, she could feel the other students watching her. Tony had started making bets with his friends about whether Mary would hit the target at all. They weren't trying to hide it anymore. $5 says she misses the paper completely," Tony whispered to Steve during one session. "You're on," Steve replied. "But make it $10. Mary heard them and felt her face burn with shame. She raised the gun, tried to line up the sights, and pulled the trigger. The shot went wide, missing not just the target but the entire wooden frame holding it. Tony burst out laughing. "Pay up, Steve. I told you she'd miss everything." Even some of the quieter students started smiling. Mary wanted to disappear. She wanted to put the gun down and walk out and never come back. Instead, she loaded more bullets and tried again. After class, Lisa tried to make her feel better. "Don't listen to them," she said. "You're improving. I can see it." But Mary knew Lisa was just being nice. She wasn't improving. If anything, she was getting worse. The pressure of everyone watching her was making her more nervous, and the more nervous she got, the worse she shot. That night, Mary sat at her kitchen table with all 3 library books spread out in front of her. She read about stance, grip, breathing, and sight picture until her eyes hurt. One book mentioned that many great shooters started out terrible and only got better through hundreds of hours of practice. Mary looked at the small pile of targets she had brought home from class. They were full of holes, but none of the holes were in the right place. Her ex-husband had been right about one thing. She was failing at this just like she failed at everything else. But as she looked at the scattered bullet holes, Mary noticed something. Her shots from the first week were all over the place, but her shots from this week were at least grouped together, even if they were in the wrong part of the target. Maybe that was something. She pulled out a notebook and started writing down everything she had learned from the books. She wrote about breathing techniques, about how to hold the gun, about how to focus on the front sight. She wrote until her hand cramped, filling page after page with notes. The fourth week was more of the same. Mary's shots were still missing the center of the target by inches. Tony and Steve had started a running commentary about her shooting, making jokes that got louder each week. Maybe she should try archery instead, Tony suggested after Mary's first shot went high and to the right. Or maybe knitting, Steve added. Safer for everyone. Even Jake was starting to look frustrated with her progress. During one session, he spent extra time with her, adjusting her stance and grip, but nothing seemed to help. I don't understand, Jake said quietly. Your form looks right, but the shots aren't going where they should. Mary nodded, feeling like she might cry. She was letting everyone down, including herself. After class, she sat in her car and seriously considered quitting. Maybe Tony was right. Maybe some people just weren't meant to shoot guns. But when she got home, she opened her notebook again and read through all her notes. Something in one of the books caught her attention, a chapter about mental training and visualization. The author said that many Olympic shooters spent as much time training their minds as their bodies. Mary had never thought about that before. She had been so focused on her hands and her stance that she hadn't thought about what was going on in her head. Maybe that was the problem. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine herself shooting. She pictured the gun in her hands, the sights, lined up perfectly, the trigger being squeezed slowly and smoothly. She imagined the bullet flying straight to the center of the target. It seemed silly, but the book said it worked. Mary decided she would try anything at this point. She had 6 more weeks of class left and she wasn't going to quit. Not yet. Even if everyone thought she was hopeless, she would keep trying. She owed that much to herself. What nobody in the class knew was that Mary had turned her small apartment into a secret training center. Every evening after work at the library, she would move her coffee table aside and practice what the books called dry firing. She had bought a plastic practice gun that looked and felt like a real pistol, but couldn't shoot real bullets. Mary would stand in her living room for an hour each night, pointing the practice gun at a small target she had taped to the wall. She worked on her stance, her grip, and her breathing. The book said that dry firing was just as important as live firing, maybe more important. It let you practice the basics without worrying about noise or cost. She also started doing something that felt strange at first: meditation. One of the books talked about how champion shooters used meditation to calm their minds and focus better. Mary had never meditated before, but she was willing to try anything. Every morning before work, she would sit quietly for 10 minutes and practice breathing slowly and deeply. At first, her mind wandered to her divorce, her job, and all the things that worried her. But gradually, she learned to push those thoughts away and focus on just breathing. The meditation helped with more than just shooting. Mary found herself feeling calmer at work and sleeping better at night. For the first time in months, she felt like she had some control over her life. During the 5th week of class, something happened that changed everything for Mary. After another frustrating session where her shots were scattered across the target, she stayed behind to talk to Jake. Most of the other students had left, but she could hear Tony and Steve in the parking lot, still making jokes about her shooting. "Jake, can I ask you something personal?" Mary said as she helped him collect the empty brass casings. "Sure, what's on your mind?" Mary took a deep breath. "Did you ever know someone who started out terrible at something but got really good later?" Jake stopped what he was doing and looked at her. "Yeah, actually, me. When I first joined the Army, I was the worst shot in my unit. Couldn't hit a barn door if I was standing inside the barn." This surprised Mary. Jake seemed like he had been born knowing how to shoot. "What happened? How did you get better?" "Time and practice. But mostly I stopped trying so hard to impress everyone else and started focusing on what I needed to do." Jake picked up another handful of brass. "Why do you ask?" Mary hesitated. then decided to tell him something she had never told anyone. My father was in the army too, Vietnam. He was a sniper. Jake stopped working and gave her his full attention. Really? Did he teach you to shoot? No. Mary's voice got quiet. He died in a car accident when I was 12, before he could teach me anything about guns. But I have his medals at home, and I've been carrying his Purple Heart in my purse to every class. Jake was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "That explains a lot." What do you mean? You're not just learning to shoot. You're trying to connect with your father. That's a lot of pressure to put on yourself. Jake sat down on a bench and motioned for Mary to sit beside him. Can I tell you something about your dad's generation of soldiers? Mary nodded. They didn't learn to shoot overnight either. Most of them were farm boys or city kids who had never touched a gun before the army. But they had something that made them good. They didn't give up. They kept trying even when everyone said they couldn't do it. Mary felt tears starting in her eyes, but she didn't want to cry in front of Jake. Your father would be proud of you for not quitting, Jake continued. That takes real courage. That night, Mary went to her bedroom closet and pulled out a small wooden box she hadn't opened in years. Inside were her father's military medals, including his Purple Heart, his Bronze Star, and his marksmanship badges. There was also a faded photo of him in his army uniform, looking young and serious. Mary had avoided looking at these things since her divorce, because they reminded her of how disappointed her father would be and how her life had turned out. But now, holding his Purple Heart, she felt something different. She felt like he would want her to keep trying. She also found something else in the box, an old army manual on rifle marksmanship that had belonged to her father. The pages were yellow, and the cover was worn, but the information inside was still good. Mary stayed up until midnight reading it, taking notes on things she hadn't learned in the modern books. The old manual talked about something called natural point of aim and breathing techniques that were different from what Jake had taught them. It also had a whole chapter on mental preparation that was much more detailed than anything Mary had read before. Meanwhile, the dynamics in the shooting class had settled into a clear pattern. Tony and Steve had become the unofficial leaders of the group. They were always the first to finish their shooting, and they spent the rest of the time giving advice to others or making comments about people's technique. Tony had started bringing his own gun to class, a fancy pistol with custom grips that he was very proud of. He would let the other men hold it and examine it, but he never offered to let Mary or the other women try it. Steve had become the class expert on everything. Whenever Jake explained something, Steve would nod knowingly or add his own comments. He talked about his police training and his experience with different types of guns. Some of the other students seemed impressed, but Mary noticed that Jake didn't seem to appreciate the interruptions. Lisa had improved quite a bit since the first week. Her shots were now hitting the target consistently, even if they weren't in the center. She had become friends with Mary and often sat with her during the classroom portions of the lessons. I don't know how you stay so calm when they make those comments, Lisa said to Mary one evening as they walked to their cars together. I'm not calm, Mary admitted. I just don't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing me upset. Well, you're tougher than I am. If Tony said half that stuff to me, I'd probably cry. Mary almost told Lisa that she had cried many times, but always at home where nobody could see. Instead, she just smiled and said, "We all deal with things differently." What Mary didn't tell Lisa was that she had started to notice things about the other students that nobody else seemed to see. She watched how Tony's shots got worse when he was showing off. She noticed that Steve's hands shook slightly when Jake was watching him closely. She saw that the quieter students often shot better than the loud ones. Mary was becoming a student of human behavior as well as marksmanship. While everyone else was focused on their own shooting, she was observing and learning from everyone's mistakes and successes. She also noticed that Jake had started paying more attention to her form and technique. He would make small corrections to her stance or grip, and lately he had been staying close when she shot, offering quiet encouragement that the others couldn't hear. Your breathing is getting much better, he told her during the 6th week, and your stance is more natural now. Mary's scores were still the worst in the class, but Jake was right. Her form was improving. The books and the nightly practice were starting to show results, even if they weren't visible on the targets yet. During the 6th week, something interesting happened. The class was shooting at 30 feet now, and everyone was struggling with the longer distance. Tony's usual confidence was shaken when several of his shots missed the target completely. "This distance is stupid," he complained loudly. "Nobody needs to shoot this far for self-defense." But Mary noticed that her shots, while still not hitting the center, were at least staying on the paper. For the first time, she wasn't the only one missing the target. Jake noticed too. After class, he approached Mary with a small smile on his face. "You know what I saw today?" he asked. "What?" "Consistency. Your shots are starting to group together. They're not in the center yet, but they're going to the same place each time. That's actually harder to achieve than getting lucky with one good shot." Mary felt a small spark of hope. Maybe all her secret practice was starting to pay off. Maybe her father's manual and the meditation and the hours of dry firing were actually working. That night, she opened her notebook and wrote down everything she had observed about the other students. She wrote about Tony's inconsistency when he was under pressure. She wrote about Steve's tendency to rush his shots when other people were watching. She wrote about which techniques seemed to work and which ones didn't. Mary was learning that shooting was about much more than just pointing a gun and pulling a trigger. It was about understanding yourself, controlling your emotions, and staying focused when everything around you was trying to distract you. She was also learning that sometimes the quietest person in the room was paying the most attention. The 8th week of class started like all the others. Mary arrived early, as she always did, and sat in the back corner with her notebook ready. She had been practicing every single night for 6 weeks now, and while her scores were still the lowest in the class, she could feel something changing inside her. The gun didn't feel foreign in her hands anymore, and her breathing had become steady and controlled. Jake walked into the classroom with a different energy than usual. He seemed excited about something, and Mary noticed he was carrying a small wooden box that she had never seen before. "Good morning, everyone," Jake said as the students settled into their seats. "Today I have something special to announce." Tony looked up from his phone with interest. Steve straightened in his chair. Even the quieter students seemed curious about what Jake had to say. "Next week will be our final class together," Jake continued. "And I thought we should end with a little friendly competition." The word competition sent a buzz through the room. Mary felt her stomach tighten with nervousness, but she kept listening. Jake opened the wooden box and pulled out a beautiful trophy. It was about 12 inches tall with a golden figure of a person holding a pistol. The base was made of dark wood with a brass plate that read Pine Ridge Gun Range, Precision Shooting Champion. "Here's how it will work," Jake explained. "Each of you will get one shot, just one, at a special target. The person who comes closest to a perfect shot wins this trophy and gets their name on the range's wall of champions." Mary's heart started beating faster. One shot. That meant she couldn't rely on getting lucky with multiple attempts. She would have to make her single bullet count. "What kind of target?" Steve asked. He was already leaning forward in his chair, clearly interested in winning. Jake smiled. "A playing card, specifically the ace of spades. It will be placed 50 yards away, and you'll need to hit as close to the center of the spade as possible." Tony let out a low whistle. 50 yards, that's serious distance for a handgun, which is why it's a real test of skill, Jake replied. "Anyone can get lucky at 15 or 20 feet, but 50 yards separates the beginners from the marksmen." The classroom erupted in excited chatter. Tony immediately started talking about his hunting experiences and how 50 yards was nothing for someone with his skills. Steve mentioned his police training and how he regularly qualified at longer distances than that. Mary sat quietly in her corner, feeling overwhelmed. 50 yards seemed impossible. She still struggled to hit the center of a target at 25 feet. How could she possibly hit something as small as a playing card at twice that distance? "The shooting order will be based on your current class rankings," Jake announced. "Lowest scores shoot first, highest scores shoot last." Mary's face burned with embarrassment. That meant she would be shooting first in front of everyone with all eyes on her. She would set the standard for failure before anyone else even tried. "Don't worry, Mary," Tony called out loud enough for everyone to hear. "At least you won't have to watch everyone else show you how it's done." Several students laughed, and Mary felt that familiar shame wash over her. But underneath the shame, she felt something else, a small flame of determination that had been growing stronger each week. After class, Mary drove straight to the cemetery where her father was buried. She had only visited his grave a few times, since the funeral 30 years ago, and never since her divorce. But today, something pulled her there. The headstone was simple gray granite with his name, dates, and the words, "Beloved Father and Soldier." Mary knelt down and pulled the Purple Heart from her purse, placing it gently on top of the stone. "Dad, I need your help," she whispered, feeling foolish for talking to a gravestone but needing to say the words anyway. "I've been trying to learn something you were good at, and I'm not very good at it yet. But I'm not going to quit. I promise you that." The wind rustled through the oak tree above his grave, and Mary took that as a sign that he had heard her. She stayed there for almost an hour, telling him about the class, about Tony's comments, about how much she wanted to prove that she wasn't the failure everyone thought she was. That evening, Mary's practice session was different from all the others. Instead of just pointing her practice gun at the target on her wall, she moved it back as far as her small apartment would allow. She taped a playing card to the far wall and practiced aiming at the tiny spade symbol in the center. The card looked impossibly small from across her living room, which was only about 20 feet. She tried to imagine how small it would look at 50 yards and felt discouraged, but she kept practicing anyway, focusing on her breathing and trying to hold the sights perfectly steady. The next morning, Mary did something she had never done before. She called in sick to work. She had never used a sick day for anything other than actually being sick, but she needed this time to prepare. Instead of going to the library, Mary drove to a public library in the next town where nobody knew her. She spent the entire day researching everything she could find about long-distance pistol shooting. She read about how Olympic shooters prepared for competition, about breathing techniques used by military snipers, and about the mental preparation that separated good shooters from great ones. One article talked about something called the zone, a mental state where everything else disappeared except for the shooter, the gun, and the target. The author described it as a feeling of perfect calm and focus where the shot felt inevitable rather than hopeful. Mary had never experienced anything like that, but she wanted to. She spent that afternoon at home practicing meditation more seriously than ever before. She sat perfectly still for 30 minutes, focusing only on her breathing and trying to quiet all the worried thoughts in her mind. For the next 3 days, Mary's entire life revolved around preparing for the competition. She practiced dry firing for 2 hours each evening instead of 1. She meditated every morning and evening. She even changed her diet, eating lighter meals because one of the books said that a full stomach could affect your stability and breathing. She also did something that surprised even her. She started visualizing success instead of failure. Every night before bed, she would close her eyes and imagine herself at the shooting range, calm and confident, raising the gun smoothly and sending her bullet directly through the center of the ace of spades. At first, the visualization felt fake and silly, but the more she practiced it, the more real it became in her mind. She could see herself standing at the firing line, feel the gun in her hands, hear the silence as she took her shot, and imagine the satisfaction of a perfect hit. Meanwhile, the rest of the class was also preparing, but in different ways. Tony spent the week at the range practicing with his custom pistol, shooting at longer and longer distances. He bragged to anyone who would listen about the tight groups he was shooting, and how easy the competition would be for someone with his experience. Steve was more methodical in his preparation. He researched the ballistics of the ammunition they would be using and calculated how much the bullet would drop over 50 yards. He practiced his breathing techniques and worked on his stance to make sure he would be perfectly steady. Even Lisa was taking the competition seriously. She had improved so much since the first week that she actually had a chance of doing well. She practiced at the range twice during the week and seemed more confident than Mary had ever seen her, but none of them were preparing with the intensity that Mary was. None of them had turned it into a personal mission the way she had. None of them were carrying the weight of wanting to prove themselves after a lifetime of being told they weren't good enough. The night before the competition, Mary couldn't sleep. She lay in bed thinking about her father, about her ex-husband's cruel words, about Tony's mocking comments, and about how much this single shot had come to mean to her. She got up at midnight and sat at her kitchen table with her father's old Army manual open in front of her. She read the chapter on mental preparation one more time, taking notes on techniques for staying calm under pressure. One passage caught her attention. The best shot is not the one who tries the hardest, but the one who lets go of trying and simply allows the shot to happen naturally. Mary read that sentence over and over again. She had been trying so hard for 8 weeks, fighting against her nervousness and her self-doubt. Maybe tomorrow she needed to stop trying so hard and just trust in all the preparation she had done. At 3 in the morning, Mary finally fell asleep with her father's manual still open beside her. In her dreams, she was standing at a firing line with perfect confidence, raising a gun that felt like a natural extension of her body, and sending a bullet exactly where she wanted it to go. Tomorrow would be the day she found out if dreams could become reality. Mary woke up on competition day feeling strangely calm. After weeks of nervousness and self-doubt, she felt like something had shifted inside her during the night. She made herself a simple breakfast, did her morning meditation, and drove to Pine Ridge Gun Range without the usual butterflies in her stomach. The weather was perfect, no wind, clear blue skies, and comfortable temperature. As Mary walked into the building, she could hear the excited chatter of her classmates. Everyone had arrived early and the energy in the room was electric. "Today's the day we separate the shooters from the wannabes," Tony announced loudly as Mary walked in. He was wearing a new camouflage shirt and had brought his expensive custom pistol in a fancy case. Steve nodded in agreement while cleaning his department-issued service weapon. 50 yards is going to show everyone's true skill level. No more. Beginner's luck at close range. Jake entered the room carrying the same wooden box with the trophy inside. "Good morning, champions. Everyone ready for some serious shooting?" The class responded with enthusiasm except for Mary, who simply nodded quietly from her usual spot in the back corner. She had her father's Purple Heart in her pocket and felt his presence with her. "Before we go to the range, let me explain exactly how this will work," Jake said. "We're going to walk out to the 50-yard line together. I'll set up one target, a single playing card attached to a cardboard backer. Each of you will take your turn in order of your current class ranking." He looked around the room. "That means Mary shoots first, then Lisa, then Pete, and so on. Steve and Tony will shoot last since they have the highest scores." Mary felt 12 pairs of eyes turned toward her. Some looked sympathetic, others looked amused, and a few looked like they felt sorry for her. "The goal is simple," Jake continued. "Get your bullet as close to the center of the spade symbol as possible. I'll measure each shot with calipers, and the closest shot wins." Tony leaned over to his friend Danny and whispered something that made them both laugh. Mary heard him say something about getting the embarrassment out of the way first, but she didn't react. 20 minutes later, the entire class stood at the 50-yard firing line. Jake had set up a small black ace of spades attached to a white cardboard square. Even with the white background, the card looked incredibly small at that distance. "Jesus," Lisa whispered to Mary. "That looks impossible." Mary stared at the target and felt that strange, calm feeling grow stronger. For weeks, this distance had seemed overwhelming, but now it just looked like another challenge to meet. "Mary, you're up first," Jake called out. The talking stopped. Everyone stepped back to give her room, but Mary could feel them all watching her. This was the moment they expected her to fail spectacularly in front of everyone. Mary walked to the firing line and picked up the .22 caliber pistol they had been using all semester. It felt familiar and comfortable in her hands now, like an old friend. She loaded one bullet into the chamber and set the gun down on the bench in front of her. She closed her eyes for a moment and did something nobody expected. She smiled. All the meditation, all the practice, all the hours reading her father's manual had led to this single moment. She thought about her father watching from somewhere, and about her ex-husband who had told her she would never be good at anything. Mary picked up the gun and took her shooting stance. Her feet were shoulder-width apart, her body leaning slightly forward, both hands gripping the pistol exactly as Jake had taught them and exactly as her father's manual had described. She raised the gun toward the target and lined up the sights. The front sight settled perfectly in the notch of the rear sight, and both lined up on the tiny spade symbol 50 yards away. Mary took a deep breath and let half of it out, just like she had practiced thousands of times in her apartment. The world seemed to get very quiet. Mary couldn't hear the other students breathing or shifting their feet. She couldn't hear the birds singing or the traffic on the road nearby. There was only her, the gun, and the target. The trigger seemed to squeeze itself. Mary didn't remember pulling it, but suddenly the gun fired with a sharp crack that echoed across the range. Jake raised his binoculars and looked downrange at the target. His expression changed from neutral to surprised to amazed. "Well, I'll be damned," he said quietly. "What happened?" Tony asked impatiently. "Did she even hit the cardboard?" Jake lowered his binoculars and looked at Mary with something like respect. "She hit the card, dead center of the spade." The silence that followed was complete. Nobody moved or spoke for at least 10 seconds. "Are you sure?" Steve asked, raising his own binoculars. "I'm sure," Jake replied. "That's the best shot I've seen at this range in 5 years. Tony grabbed the binoculars from Steve and looked for himself. His confident expression slowly changed to shock and then to something that looked like anger. "That's impossible," he said. "She can barely hit the target at 25 feet. "Well, she just hit a playing card at 50 yards, Jake said matter-of-factly. "Lisa, you're up next." For the next hour, the rest of the class took their shots. Lisa hit the cardboard but missed the card completely. Pete's shot was close but still inches away from the spade. Danny hit the edge of the card but nowhere near the center. As the better shooters took their turns, the pressure mounted. Each person was trying to beat Mary's shot, but none of them could even come close. Steve stepped up to the line with confidence, but Mary could see his hands shaking slightly as he raised his gun. His shot hit the card but was off-center by more than an inch. Finally, it was Tony's turn. He had been getting quieter and more frustrated as each shooter failed to match Mary's performance. He loaded his expensive custom pistol and took his stance with exaggerated care. "This is how you shoot at 50 yards, he announced loudly, trying to reclaim some of his lost confidence. Tony's shot was good. It hit the card near the edge of the spade symbol. Under normal circumstances, it would have been an impressive shot. But compared to Mary's perfect center hit, it looked like a miss. Jake walked downrange to examine all the targets and measure each shot precisely. When he returned, he was carrying the ace of spades with a perfect round hole punched through the exact center of the spade symbol. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a clear winner," Jake announced. Mary Thompson's shot hit dead center. The closest anyone else came was about 2 inches away. The class stood in stunned silence as Jake opened the wooden box and pulled out the trophy. Mary walked forward in a daze, hardly believing what had just happened. "Congratulations, Mary," Jake said as he handed her the trophy. "That was one of the finest shots I've ever witnessed." Mary took the trophy with trembling hands. It was heavier than she expected and felt solid and real. She looked at her reflection in the brass nameplate and saw someone she barely recognized, a woman who had just accomplished something extraordinary. "How?" Tony asked, his voice cracking slightly. "How did you do that?" Mary looked at him calmly. For the first time in 8 weeks, she wasn't intimidated by his presence or his questions. "Practice," she said simply. "And patience. And remembering that sometimes the quietest person in the room is paying the most attention." Steve shook his head in disbelief. "But your scores all semester were practice," Mary finished. This was the test. As the class began to pack up their equipment, several of the students approached Mary with genuine congratulations and apologies. Even Tony, though clearly struggling with his pride, managed to shake her hand and mumble something about a good shot. Lisa hugged Mary tightly. "I knew you had it in you," she said. though her expression suggested she was as surprised as everyone else. Jake approached Mary as she was putting the trophy carefully in her car. "You know what impressed me most?" he asked. "What?" "You were the only one who didn't seem nervous. Everyone else was trying so hard to make the perfect shot that they got in their own way. You just let it happen." Mary nodded, thinking about her father's manual and the passage about allowing the shot to happen naturally. "Someone once told me that the best shot is the one who stops trying so hard." "Your father?" "In a way, yes." As Mary drove home with the trophy in the passenger seat, she thought about calling her ex-husband to tell him what she had accomplished. But then she realized she didn't need his validation anymore. She had proven something much more important to herself. That evening, Mary returned to the cemetery and placed the trophy next to her father's headstone. She sat there as the sun set, telling him about her perfect shot and thanking him for watching over her. "I did it, Dad," she whispered. "I found something I'm good at. Something that's mine." The wind rustled through the oak tree above his grave, and Mary smiled. She had finally proven to herself that she was capable of excellence, and that was worth more than any trophy.